Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm reviewing 13 different tomatoes that I grew this season in my garden. Tomatoes are my absolute favorite thing to grow. There's so many things that I like to do with them, so I do dedicate a large portion of my garden space to growing lots of different kinds of tomatoes every year. This is just a small selection from what I harvested today in my garden. I like to make these kinds of videos because maybe you're looking for more information about a certain cultivar that I'm showing in this video today, or maybe you're just looking for inspiration on some new varieties to try growing next season in your garden. If you're new here, my name is Jared and I teach people how to garden and grow food. This video is one of many gardening tutorials or guides that can be found on my channel. Make sure you subscribe, that way you don't miss a single one. Before we get into it, I do want to mention if you want to try growing any of these tomatoes right here, or really anything in my garden that I show in my videos, most likely you can find seeds or plants on my website. Alright, so let's get started. The one that I'm most excited about is this one right here. This is the biggest one that I've harvested this season yet. And I have to admit, I don't really know the official cultivar name for this. I got it in a seed trade. The only thing the gardener said about it is that it's a tomato cultivar that comes from a region of Italy called Fali, if I'm saying that correctly. So I'm just gonna name this one Fali for reference, okay? This is an indeterminate tomato and it produces loads and clusters of these really big, large sized tomatoes. This type of tomato shape is called a heart, or sometimes referred to as ox heart tomatoes, and typically they're best for paste or making tomato sauce. What makes for a good sauce tomato is that it's really meaty inside and dry. It doesn't have a lot of liquid in there. So because of that, it's usually not the best for fresh eating, but it's awesome for making sauces. When you're canning or making sauces, you have to get rid of that extra liquid. So it really is helpful if you're using a tomato that's on the dry side to begin with. All right, so I moved everything to the side. That way you guys can see me slice into it. I always mention in my tomato review videos that my favorite tool for cutting tomatoes is actually a serrated knife, because this actually slices into the tomato without squishing it and therefore releasing a whole bunch of juice. You'll know what I mean when you make the switch. All right, so right off the bat, it's what I expected. This is a very meaty type of sauce tomato. They also typically don't have too many seeds, which is, again, really useful if you're making sauce. Like I said, usually sauce tomatoes aren't the best for fresh eating, but I'm still gonna try it. It doesn't taste bad. It definitely tastes better than any tomato you could buy from the grocery store. Its flavor is a little bit more subtle, but it's sweet. I could definitely see this making for a good sauce though. Usually when you expose these kinds of tomatoes to heat, that's when the flavor truly develops and it makes for a really good sauce. All in all, I really like this one and my plants are loaded, so I will be harvesting a lot more of these within the next couple weeks. All right, moving on, we have this little cherry-sized tomato right here. This one is called Agrapoli di Invierno. It's an Italian tomato. Its name means winter grape because usually in Italy, they'll harvest the plants and hang them upside down indoors. That way they can still harvest fresh tomatoes even in the middle of winter. If you know anything about that type of preservation technique, please comment below. I'm also experimenting with that in my house. This one makes for a great storage tomato because it kind of has a thicker skin, so it retains that moisture, locks it in, so it doesn't go bad as soon as like other tomatoes do when they're sitting on the kitchen counter. This one is also not really famous for its flavor when eaten fresh, but it's great for making sauces or putting slices on a pizza. What I noted about this plant is that it's super productive, which is usually the case with most cherries. They kind of ramble and just keep producing no matter what happens. I just noticed a savory, sweet kind of flavor. It's not bad, but again, better suited for making sauces. Next up, we have a tomato called Beauty King. This is actually a dwarf cultivar. I decided to give this one a try because I grew another dwarf cultivar called Susie's Beauty, and I was so impressed by that one that I decided to try this one as well. This one could use a little bit more ripening up, but if you notice, it just has this really cool red blushing with these green streaks. This one's a little bit more ripened up than that one, and you can kind of see those streaks a little bit better. What I like about dwarf tomatoes is that they usually grow to be about 2 to 3 feet tall, which is great, especially if you have a small garden, but they still produce full-size beefsteak tomatoes. This one's on the smaller side compared to what it usually produces. But let's slice into this one. Its flesh is very light pink in color, probably intensifies as this ripens up just a little bit more. But let's taste it. Wow, I'm actually really impressed by the flavor of this one. It's delicious. It's well balanced. I have that acidity. I have the sweetness, like everything you could want in a fresh eating type of tomato. You could make sauce with it, but again, this definitely has a lot more water content in there, so you just have to spend more time cooking that extra water out of your sauce. A lot of people rave about this one, and I totally agree. This is a good one. Next, we have Dwarf Susie's Beauty, which is what inspired me to try growing the Dwarf Beauty King. This tomato is yellow when ripe, and the more riper it gets a little bit more red streaking looking, especially in the inside. And like I said, dwarf cultivars are just dwarf in plant size, but they still produce full size like beefsteak tomatoes or whatever type of tomato it's supposed to be. Last season, Susie's Booty was the biggest tomato that I grew. It was almost 2 pounds. I was very impressed considering that it's a dwarf cultivar. So let's slice into this one. Really pretty inside, lots of juice, and it has this beautiful like red marbling effect in there. This is definitely one of my favorites. It just has that perfect amount of acidity and sweetness. Really good for sandwiches. Another thing that I noticed about growing Susie's Booty is that in general, all of the tomatoes that it produces tend to be on the large side. Because sometimes you'll grow a beefsteak and like the first couple tomatoes are really big, but then after that, they start getting smaller and smaller. But this one is very consistent in terms of size. The next tomato is Nieves Azorian Red, if I'm saying that correctly, or maybe it's Nieves Azorian Red. I'm not sure. If you know, please comment below. This one was apparently brought to the United States by a family from the Azores. What made me excited to try this one out is that it's actually the parent of one of my absolute favorite heirloom tomatoes called Tex Wine. So I just wanted to see how this would compare. Nieves Azorian Red definitely has a particular look to it. It's usually a scarlet, bright red color, and the shoulders tend to have like yellow streaking on it. And I noticed that characteristic carried over with the Tex Wine tomatoes as well. This tomato is also supposed to be much bigger in size. It's known for being a big size beefsteak. This one so far has been the biggest one that has ripened up for me, but there's another one still on the vine that is much bigger than this one. It has a good standard tomato flavor. It's a little bit more mild in intensity than, let's say, this Beauty King right here that I just tried, but still really good. It's really juicy and meaty, so that makes for a really good sandwich tomato. Sometimes when you try a tomato, just that particular one maybe didn't have all that full, intense tomato flavor that you were expecting, but the next one that you pull off from the vine does. So it just depends. A lot of people try different things to apparently affect the flavor of tomatoes, but according to my research and just commentary from other, big tomato growers, is that there's nothing really you can do to manipulate the flavor of tomatoes, except for growing them in soils that are very high in lots of different minerals. So like soils that have a lot of volcanic rock, for example, which is why so many people say the tomatoes from Italy are fantastic, because Italy has an active volcano and a lot of their soils have those minerals in it, so that's why they taste so different. Next up, we have a tomato that is green when it's ready and ripe. This one is called Moven Green. It's kind of a rare tomato, and it does come from Moldova. I've tried growing lots of different kinds of green tomatoes, and sometimes they can be a little difficult to tell if they're ripe because they're not going to turn red like other tomatoes. So you just kind of have to press around the shoulders to see if it gives, and if it does, then they're ripe and ready. But this cultivar is a little unique because it turns a little bit yellow on the bottom, and that's how you know that they're ready for harvest. And there you go. This tomato is pretty juicy. And just so you know, because I didn't know, somebody was asking me what tomato do I recommend to make fried green tomatoes. So I recommended a tomato that is green at harvest time. But that's not what you need when you're making fried green tomatoes. What you need is actually just an unripe tomato in general that is still green. And I didn't know that because I never ate fried green tomatoes before. So I kind of immediately went and found a restaurant and finally tried some fried green tomatoes, and I absolutely love it. If I had to recommend a tomato good for fried green tomatoes, I would say Kellogg's Breakfast, because that tomato is just really big and beefy, so it would make for some really awesome fried green tomatoes. But anyways, back to the Moven Green. Let me taste it right here. It's bright, it's sweet, it's acidic. It definitely would make for a good contrast in like bruschetta or salsa with regular red tomatoes, so you get like all these different flavor profiles in there. Very good. One thing to note about Moven Green, some people will say it's a beefsteak, but with my experience growing it, I think it's more of a slicer. My plants anyways have been pretty consistent with growing this size of a tomato, which I call them a slicer when they're this size. They're bigger than a cherry, but smaller than like a huge beefsteak or something like that. And the plant is very productive. I've harvested so many of these. And the skin is really good and smooth. It seems to have a pretty decent crack resistance, which is an issue that I really struggle with here in Florida. When it rains here, it just dumps, it pours. So what happens is the plants start absorbing all of this extra water from the soil, and the skin can't grow fast enough to kind of keep up with it, so it starts splitting. It's still totally edible and fine if it splits, but if you can get it to look like this, all nice and perfect, I mean, it's just a beautiful tomato. Next, I have this strain of San Marzano tomato called San Marzano Redora. It's just like an extra large version of the regular San Marzano tomatoes, And it's named Redora after a mountain in Bergamo, Italy, if I'm saying that correctly. I do agree that in general, the size of these tomatoes are much bigger than your standard San Marzano. San Marzano is known to be a good quality tomato for sauce making again. This year I did grow a lot of sauce or paste tomatoes because I'm trying to increase how much of it I can. But let's slice into it. Wow, this one is super meaty. Like, you barely see any seeds in there. This is absolutely the most meaty paste tomato I've ever come across. Let me take a bite out of it. I'm not expecting much again because it's a sauce tomato, but let's see. It's got a very smooth texture. So it's just as I expected for a paste tomato. Not the best for fresh eating flavor-wise, but I can definitely see how this will make some really good sauce. All right, so moving along, I did try 2 hybrids this season, just out of curiosity. This one is called Galahad, and this one is called Granadero. These were recommended to me by some other gardeners because they said they produced a ton in their garden. So I just wanted to see if that was true. They both have very high disease resistances to a bunch of all sorts of different kinds of diseases. And I do have to agree, their plants definitely look a lot healthier than my heirlooms right now. However, I don't agree that they are more productive than the same heirlooms that I'm growing. At least so far, they haven't impressed me with the quantity of tomatoes that the plants have been able to produce. Granadero is supposed to be kind of like a Roma tomato. It is better for paste and sauce making. One thing to note about both of these hybrid tomatoes is that their skin is kind of thick, or like very crisp and firm, and they don't crack very much either. Like when I look at these Galahad tomatoes, this is like a perfect grocery store tomato. And that's usually what hybrids are bred for, to look very nice, not for flavor, which again is why I like to grow my heirlooms. But anyways, let's try this Granadero right here. It's pretty good actually. Kind of has a sweet flavor to it. In terms of being a good sauce tomato, I don't know. It has a lot of liquid in there, so I don't know if it would be the best for sauce making. Probably very good for making salsas though. This one right here is the Galahad. Looks perfect. I mean, that skin is not cracked at all. Looks like I bought them at the grocery store. The tomatoes that it produces are also pretty similar in size. They all come out about this big. Let's slice into this one. Pretty nice and meaty, standard looking tomato. Flavor is good, pretty balanced. You have a little bit of sweetness and savoriness in there. Just pretty normal, average tomato in my opinion. If you struggle with a lot of diseases or tomato cracking, then I would recommend these 2 hybrid tomatoes to you. Next up, we have another tomato that is usually used for sauce making. This one is called 10 Fingers of Naples. Right off the bat, I have to say this is a super productive plant. Don't let their small size fool you. Those plants are so productive, you just have handfuls and handfuls of these every single day. So it's gonna make a lot of sauce for you. Usually what I find is that the plants that make smaller size tomatoes produce so much of them that in terms of how much it produced by weight is higher than like a beefsteak. So even though the beefsteak is a bigger size tomato, the plants produce less of them. So overall, in terms of production by weight, sometimes these plants with little tomatoes produce more. So if you want to make sauce, this is a good choice. I believe this one is also an heirloom that originally came from Italy. It kind of reminds me of a Roma tomato, which I have also grown Roma tomatoes, and I wasn't impressed. I know it's a great cultivar for a lot of other gardeners, but in my garden, it wasn't that happy. It produced a few for me. This one though produces loads and loads. And you can see that the inside, they're pretty meaty as well. It has a nice smooth texture, has a little bit of sweetness in there. They're not my top choice for fresh eating like some of these beefsteaks or slicers, but definitely will make some good sauce for you. Next up, we have a really cool looking tomato. This one is called Speckled Roman. It kind of reminds me of a larger Roma tomato, but it has this really beautiful red and orange striping. This is another tomato good for making paste or sauce, and the inside is super meaty. It has a very mild flavor though, so I don't recommend for fresh eating, which is absolutely normal for the sauce or paste tomatoes. It has a lot of meat though, which is gonna give you a lot of sauce. Plus it just looks so cool. I've never seen a striped tomato in the grocery store. Next up, we have another striped tomato. This one is called Sunrise Bumblebee. I've grown this one a couple times, and I do have to say, for whatever reason, the plants just kind of take a while to get established and to really start putting on growth and production as compared to some of the other cherries that I've grown. But I absolutely love the flavor of this one. This tomato, I can honestly tell you, has really good flavor. It really stands out compared to, you know, your average tomato. These tomatoes start out yellow like this, but as they ripen up, they get more and more red and orange streaking like this one. For the best flavor, let this ripen up as much as possible. A good indicator is when there's a lot of streaks on it. I love the flavor. It's juicy, it's bright, it's sweet, it's savory. It's not on the level of like a Sun Gold or a Sun Sugar, but it definitely stands out among all of the tomatoes that I grow. If somebody were to ask me which ones were my favorite flavor-wise, I would recommend this one. Alright guys, we have our last tomato here. This one is called Cesare's Canestrino di Luca. It was brought over to the United States by chef Cesare Casella. This tomato is named after its shape. Canestrino means small basket in Italian. And it does have a very unique basket-like shape. This is also a pretty hard to find tomato if you want to try growing it. I recommend this one for making sauces and pastes again because the inside tends to be pretty dry. But a well-ripened Canestrino tomato kind of absorbs a lot of extra juice, and then it's good for slicing as well. Flavor-wise, I feel it just is kind of a little bit more sweeter than some of these other sauce or paste tomatoes that I tried out today. Plants are also super productive and they get really big, so expect 8 to 10 foot vines. Well, that's it guys. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope I inspired you to try out some of these tomato cultivars in your garden. And again, if you have any suggestions for me, please comment below. Thank you for watching and happy gardening.